They had seen him angry. They had seen him paranoid. They had seen him furious at his generals, furious at the weather, furious at fate. But nothing prepared Hitler's closest circle for the moment they realized something far more disturbing had taken over him. It wasn't rage, it wasn't pressure, it wasn't the stress of a collapsing front, it was detachment from reality itself. By the final months of World War II, everyone around Hitler already understood that the Third Reich was falling apart. They saw it in their reports, in the maps, in the faces of officers returning from the front. But there's a difference between knowing the war is lost and watching the man responsible pretend the war is still winnable. And the moment they realized he had slipped completely into delusion was so shocking that several generals later said they walked out of the room in silence, unable to process what had just happened. It began deep inside the Führerbunker Berlin, early 1945. The war outside was no longer a war, it was a collapse. Soviet divisions were steamrolling into the east. American and British divisions were breaking German lines in the west. Supplies were gone, fuel was gone, the Luftwaffe barely existed, and yet Hitler insisted everything could still be turned around with one decisive blow, a phrase he clung to even when it stopped meaning anything. His inner circle tried to manage him. They hid reports, they softened numbers, they avoided discussing defeats unless absolutely necessary. But reality kept forcing its way in, and eventually even they couldn't hide the truth. The moment everything snapped came during a military briefing that was supposed to be routine. The generals brought forward the latest updates, the encirclement of units, the collapse of the Eastern Front, the loss of key cities. These were not minor setbacks. These were catastrophes that would have forced any rational leader to accept the end. But when Hitler looked at the maps, he didn't see catastrophe. He saw opportunity. He stared at the situation map, an enormous display filled with red arrows pushing straight into the heart of Germany, and calmly announced that the Soviets were not advancing. They were overextending themselves. He said the Allies hadn't broken through, they were merely probing. He insisted new divisions would soon be ready to deploy, even though everyone in the room knew there were no men left to form them. One of his generals, General Heinz Guderian, tried to explain that there were no reserves left, no fuel, no tanks, no trained soldiers, but Hitler dismissed him with a wave of his hand, saying reserves always exist if you know where to look. It wasn't a strategy, it was fantasy. And then came the moment that froze the room. Hitler pointed to an area on the map where a counterattack was impossible, an area where the Wehrmacht had virtually no troops, no fuel, and no to even travel quickly. He declared that a major offensive would be launched from that exact position, not in weeks or days, but immediately. The generals looked at one another, trying to determine if this was a test, a joke, or a misunderstanding. But Hitler wasn't confused. He was certain. He insisted that a ghost army, formations that didn't exist, divisions that had been wiped out, units that had never been trained, would sweep across the Soviet lines and break their momentum. He spoke about these divisions as if they were real, as if they were ready, as if they had weapons, ammunition, and fuel. None of them existed. Silence gripped the room in a way no air raid ever could. His inner circle realized that Hitler wasn't misinformed, he wasn't mistaken, he wasn't confused by bad intelligence. He truly believed imaginary troops would materialize simply because he demanded they should. This wasn't stubbornness anymore, this was delusion. Guderian, shocked, attempted to correct him by describing the number of divisions actually left, far fewer than Hitler insisted. Hitler cut him off, shouting that numbers were irrelevant because faith and will would create new forces. He ranted that soldiers hiding in hospitals should be returned to combat, that teenagers could be formed into elite units, that wounded men could fight lying down if they had to. His eyes didn't look angry, they looked distant, fixed on something that wasn't real. Those in the room later said it felt like watching someone hallucinate with their eyes open. As Hitler spoke, his tone became more erratic. He jumped between topics, rambling about miracle weapons, betrayal, destiny, and imaginary armies waiting to strike. He talked about storms of bad weather stopping the Allies, even when forecasts showed clear skies. He insisted the Soviets would crumble any moment because nature was on Germany's side. He claimed millions of people across Europe were rising up to join him, an uprising no one else had heard of. The inner circle realized he had lost the ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. At that point, several generals simply stopped taking notes. There was nothing left to write down. There were no orders that could be carried out, no strategies that could be executed. They stood in silence, staring at a man who still acted like the war was in its early stages while the world around him was collapsing into dust. The moment they truly knew he was gone came when he ordered a panzer division to counterattack, a division that had been destroyed months earlier. Hitler insisted it still existed because no one had officially informed him otherwise. When one officer, shaking, told him the division had been wiped out, Hitler accused him of lying, claiming the soldiers had gone underground and could be rallied if he personally demanded it. It was at that point that any illusion of stability evaporated. They weren't looking at the leader of a collapsing empire. They were looking at a man who genuinely believed that the map in front of him would change if he glared at it hard enough. Generals later described exchanging glances that said everything they couldn't say aloud. There is no plan. There is no future. The man in charge is not mentally present anymore. After that briefing, many realized the war was not just lost. It was no longer being led by someone capable of understanding. It was lost. From that day on, the bunker changed. Conversations became whispers. Officers avoided giving him bad news. Some tried to slip out of Berlin entirely. Others quietly planned their own survival. And a few, still loyal but terrified, tried to shield him from more stress, hoping his delusion would lessen. It never did. Hitler began speaking of miracle weapons that would wipe out the Allies overnight. He believed new jet fighters would appear by the hundreds, even though factories were rubble. He believed entire armies would materialize from Volkssturm units, elderly men and teenage boys with barely any training. He believed the Soviets were weaker than ever, even as the Red Army stood only kilometers away. The inner circle tried once more to confront him with reality. They showed him photographs, casualty numbers, intercepted messages, even reports from his own trusted officers. He refused to read them. He said they were forged. He said defeatist generals were manipulating him. He said spies had infiltrated his staff. At one point, he accused his own inner circle of being too emotionally weak to understand that victory was near. Even close loyalists like Joseph Goebbels were shaken. Goebbels, who had spent years fueling Hitler's ego, now privately admitted that the Führer was living in a world of illusion. Albert Speer later recalled that Hitler could still talk at length about strategy, but his ideas no longer had any connection to reality. They were fantasies wrapped in anger and paranoia. By late April 1945, when Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin, Hitler still insisted there would be a final counterattack, a push that would drive the Soviets all the way back to Poland. His generals tried to tell him there were barely any soldiers left to defend the city. Hitler responded by screaming that they were cowards and traitors. Then he turned back to the map and began drawing imaginary divisions again, insisting they were real if properly commanded. The moment his inner circle knew, absolutely knew, that Hitler had slipped beyond recovery was when he began ordering armies that no longer existed to move across roads that no longer existed, toward objectives that no longer existed. One general said it was like watching someone try to win a chess game on an empty board. Hitler's delusion didn't just doom the war, it doomed everyone around him. He refused offers to evacuate civilians. He refused to shorten the front. He refused to surrender. He refused even to allow his governments in the occupied territories to save themselves. His fantasy of a final comeback forced entire cities to die for nothing. By the last week, some generals simply stopped reporting. Others sent fake updates because telling him the truth only caused him to lash out. In his increasingly isolated world, he talked only to those who still humored his illusions, and even they could barely keep up with the stories he invented. When Hitler finally admitted defeat, it was only because the Soviets were minutes from taking the bunker. But by then, the inner circle had long known the truth. He hadn't been leading the Reich for months. He had been leading a story inside his own mind, one where victory was always just around the corner and defeat was always someone else's fault. His final acts were not strategic decisions. They were the last flickers of a man who had lost the ability to see the world as it was, a man trapped in the illusion that willpower alone could rewrite reality. And the men who once feared him, once idolized him, once followed him without question, now watched a broken figure pacing the bunker halls, muttering to himself about armies that no longer existed, victories that would never come, and a future that had died long before he ever recognized it. The inner circle didn't need to say it aloud. They all understood the moment it happened. It was the day he ordered imaginary armies into battle, the day he argued with maps instead of generals, the day he looked at total collapse and called it success, the day they realized the most dangerous man in the world was no longer even living in the same reality as everyone else. And from that moment on, the war was no longer just unwinnable, it was leaderless.